I want you to think about a decision you made recently. Not a trivial one, a real one. A decision where you genuinely felt the weight of the alternatives, where you considered your options, where something in you deliberated and evaluated and finally settled on a course of action. The kind of decision where, afterward, you felt the sense of authorship that comes with having chosen. You could have gone the other way. You knew it. You felt it. And you did not go the other way because you, the thinking, reasoning, valuing person that you are, decided not to. Now I want to tell you what the physics says about that experience. The physics says it was an illusion, not in a soft, qualified sense. Not in the sense of being merely approximate or not quite as complete as it felt. In a precise, mathematically grounded sense that follows from the best tested physical theories we have. The deliberation you experienced, the sense of genuine alternatives that could have gone either way, the feeling of authorship over the outcome, the physics says that none of this corresponded to anything in the underlying physical reality. The decision was determined before you made it. The outcome was fixed before the deliberation began. The feeling of choosing was generated by a physical system that had already been set in motion long before the moment of decision by causes extending back to the initial conditions of the universe itself. I want to be honest with you about how difficult I find this conclusion. Not personally difficult in the sense of finding it emotionally disturbing, though I do find it that intellectually difficult in the sense that I am not fully certain it is correct, and in the sense that the arguments on the other side are serious and deserve to be heard. I'm going to take you through the full structure of the argument, both for and against, because I think the honest thing to do with a question this important is to show you the full complexity rather than to give you the clean narrative that papers over the difficulties. But I am going to tell you at the outset that the physics creates a genuine problem for the ordinary understanding of free will, not an insuperable problem, not a problem that every physicist agrees cannot be resolved, but a genuine problem that the physics forces on anyone who thinks seriously about it, and that most discussions of free will in philosophy and in popular culture do not engage with at the level of precision that the physics demands. Let me start with determinism, because it is the oldest and most straightforward version of the challenge to free will from physics. Classical mechanics, the physics of Newton and Laplace, is completely deterministic. The laws of mechanics are differential equations that relate the current state of a physical system to its future state. Given the complete state of a system at any moment, the complete state at any future moment is uniquely determined by the equations. The future is not just predictable in principle, it is fixed. It is already written in the mathematics of the equations applied to the initial conditions. The mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, writing in 1814, expressed this with a clarity that has become famous. He described a hypothetical intelligence, now called Laplace's demon, that knows the precise location and momentum of every particle in the universe and that has the computational power to apply Newton's equations to all of them simultaneously. Such an intelligence, Laplace wrote, would see the future and the past in the same way as the present, with complete clarity. Nothing would be uncertain. The future would be as determined and as knowable as the past. Classical mechanics, the physics of Newton and Laplace, is completely deterministic. The laws of mechanics are differential equations that relate the current state of a physical system to its future state. Given the complete state of a system at any moment, the complete state at any future moment is uniquely determined by the equations. The future is not just predictable in principle, it is fixed. It is already written in the mathematics of the equations applied to the initial conditions. I want to make this precise because the precision matters. Newton's second law says that the force on a particle equals its mass times its acceleration. Acceleration is the second derivative of position with respect to time. So Newton's second law is a second-order differential equation relating the position of a particle to the forces acting on it. Given the initial position and the initial velocity of every particle in a system, and given the forces that act between them, the equations determine the position and velocity of every particle at every future time. No additional information is needed. No choices are made. The equations compute the future from the present with mathematical necessity. For a system of 2 particles, this is manageable. For a system of billions of particles, like the human brain, the computation is practically impossible. But the practical impossibility is irrelevant to the philosophical point. The question is not whether we can predict the future, it is whether the future is determined, and in classical mechanics it is. The mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace, writing in 1814, expressed this with a clarity that has become famous. He described a hypothetical intelligence, now called Laplace's demon, that knows the precise location and momentum of every particle in the universe, and that has the computational power to apply Newton's equations to all of them simultaneously. Such an intelligence, Laplace wrote, would see the future and the past in the same way as the present, with complete clarity. Nothing would be uncertain. The future would be as determined and as knowable as the past. For Laplace, writing before quantum mechanics existed, this was not a thought experiment about a merely hypothetical scenario. It was a description of what he believed to be the actual structure of physical reality. The universe was a deterministic machine. The future was, in principle, completely predictable from the present. And the apparent freedom of human choice was an artifact of ignorance, of our inability to know the complete state of every particle. If we could know it, we would see that the choices we thought were free were as fixed as the orbits of the planets. Laplace never wrote explicitly about free will, but the implication of his demon for the question of human choice was immediately apparent to his contemporaries. If the future is determined, if human brains are physical systems governed by Newton's laws, then human decisions are determined by the prior states of those brains, which are determined by still prior states, going back to the initial conditions of the universe. Free will, in any sense that implies genuine alternative possibilities, seems to be excluded. This conclusion was recognized as a serious problem from the beginning. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, who was a near contemporary of Laplace, developed an elaborate philosophical framework specifically designed to preserve the possibility of freedom in the face of causal determinism. Kant's solution was to argue that causal determinism applies to the phenomenal world, the world of appearances that science describes, while freedom belongs to the noumenal world, the world of things as they are in themselves, which lies beyond the reach of scientific investigation. The human will, for Kant, is free in the noumenal realm, even though human actions are causally determined in the phenomenal realm. I find Kant's solution philosophically interesting but physically unsatisfying, for reasons I will come to. But I mention it because it shows how serious the threat from determinism was understood to be from the very beginning of classical physics. The physicist who formulated the demon and the philosopher who tried to rescue freedom from it were contemporaries, working in the same intellectual moment, recognizing the same tension. If Laplace is right, if classical mechanics is the correct description of reality, then your decision was fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. The configuration of every atom in your brain at the moment you made the decision was determined by the configuration of every atom in the universe 13.8 billion years ago. The laws of mechanics applied to those initial conditions produced exactly the neural state that produced exactly the decision that you made. You could not have decided differently, not in the sense that something prevented you, in the sense that the physics left no room for a different outcome. The initial conditions plus the laws equaled your decision with no remainder for anything else. This is a stark conclusion. And it was recognized as such by philosophers from the moment Laplace articulated it. The challenge to free will from classical determinism is not a modern worry. It is a centuries-old problem that philosophy has been wrestling with since Newton. The responses are many and various. Compatibilism, the view that free will is compatible with determinism because free will does not require the ability to have done otherwise, but only requires that decisions be caused by the right kind of internal process, is the most widely defended position among contemporary philosophers. Hard determinism, the view that determinism is true and free will is therefore an illusion, is a minority position. Libertarianism about free will, the view that free will requires the ability to do otherwise and that determinism is false, is defended by those who think that quantum mechanics or other indeterministic physics provides room for genuine freedom. I want to evaluate these responses, but before I do, I want to address the most important complication in the simple determinism picture. The complication is quantum mechanics. Now let me address the most important complication in the simple determinism picture. The complication is quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is not deterministic in the classical sense. The Schrödinger equation, which governs the evolution of quantum states, is deterministic, but the outcomes of quantum measurements are not. When a quantum system in a superposition of states is measured, the outcome is genuinely random, with probabilities given by the Born rule, but with no underlying mechanism that determines which specific outcome occurs. This is not the randomness of classical statistical mechanics, which is a consequence of ignorance about a determined underlying state. This is fundamental, irreducible randomness. The universe at the quantum level does not determine which outcome of a measurement occurs, it only determines the probabilities. This seems to open a door for free will. If the future is not determined, if there is genuine randomness in the physical world, then perhaps there is room for the kind of freedom that free will requires. Perhaps the decision you made could have gone the other way, in the physically meaningful sense that the quantum events in your brain during the deliberation could have had different outcomes. But this door, when you look carefully at what is behind it, does not lead where the proponent of free will wants to go. The problem is that randomness is not the same as freedom. If my decision is determined by a quantum random event, a random fluctuation in a neuron firing pattern, then my decision is not free in any meaningful sense. It is random. Being the output of a random process is not the same as being the output of my deliberation, my values, my reasons. The ability to have done otherwise, if it comes from quantum randomness, means only that a random number generator could have come up differently. This is not what we mean by free will. It is not the kind of authorship that makes us feel responsible for our decisions. This point is often stated more sharply by philosophers. Randomness and determinism are symmetrically bad for free will in the following sense. If determinism is true, my decision was fixed by prior causes that I did not control. If randomness is true, my decision was determined by a random process that I did not control. In neither case is there room for the kind of ultimate authorship that free will seems to require. The dilemma for free will is not determinism versus randomness. It is the deeper question of whether there is any physical process that could constitute genuine authorship in the philosophically relevant sense. Before I move on, I want to address one more attempt to find room for free will in quantum mechanics, one that is taken seriously by some physicists and philosophers. The physicist Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff have proposed that consciousness depends on quantum processes in structures called microtubules, protein polymers that form part of the cytoskeleton of neurons. Penrose and Hameroff argue that quantum superpositions in microtubules, collapsing through a process they call objective reduction, give rise to conscious experience and potentially to the kind of non-deterministic freedom that libertarian free will requires. The Penrose-Hameroff theory is controversial. Most neuroscientists are skeptical that quantum coherence, the maintenance of quantum superpositions, can be sustained in the warm, wet, noisy environment of the brain for long enough to play any role in neural computation. The decoherence times for quantum superpositions in biological systems at body temperature are typically estimated to be many orders of magnitude shorter than the timescales of neural processes. Most researchers in the field believe that the brain performs its computations using classical physics, with quantum mechanics playing no more role than it plays in the operation of any other macroscopic physical system. But even if Penrose and Hameroff were right, even if quantum processes in microtubules play an essential role in consciousness, the problem I identified earlier would not be solved. Quantum processes are random, not free. Collapsing a quantum superposition in a microtubule produces a random outcome, not a chosen one. The randomness might introduce genuine indeterminism into the neural processes that produce decisions. But indeterminism is not freedom. Being the output of a quantum random process is not the same as being the output of a deliberative process that could have gone otherwise through genuine self-determination. The dilemma for free will is not determinism versus randomness. It is the deeper question of whether there is any physical process that could constitute genuine authorship in the philosophically relevant sense. The philosopher Galen Strawson developed what he called the basic argument for the impossibility of free will, which I want to describe because I think it captures the essential problem with great clarity. The argument goes like this. You make a decision. The decision is caused by something, your mental state at the time, your values, your deliberation, your character. But those causes were themselves caused by prior states, your genetics, your upbringing, your experiences, and those prior states were caused by still prior states, going back before your birth, before your parents' choices, before any state that you had any control over. You did not choose your initial nature. You did not choose the initial conditions of the chain of causes that produced your decision. And if you did not choose the causes, you cannot be ultimately responsible for the effects. The argument is simple and, I think, powerful. But I want to tell you where it can be resisted, because the resistance is serious and worth understanding. The most influential response to the basic argument is compatibilism, and I want to give it its full due before explaining why I find it incomplete as a response to the physical challenge. Compatibilism says that free will, properly understood, does not require ultimate responsibility in Strawson's sense. It requires only that your decision be caused by the right kind of process. If your decision is caused by your values, your deliberation, your reasons, rather than by external coercion or by a malfunctioning brain or by an alien mind control device, then you made a free decision. The causal history that produced your values and your deliberative capacities is not relevant to the freedom of the decision. What matters is that the immediate causes of the decision are the right kind of internal processes. Compatibilism is held by most contemporary philosophers of free will. It has the virtue of preserving most of what we care about in ordinary free will talk. It allows for a meaningful distinction between free decisions and coerced ones. It preserves the basis for moral responsibility. It explains why we praise and blame people for their actions while not holding them responsible for things outside their control. It is a coherent and sophisticated philosophical position. But it does not fully satisfy the worry that the physics generates. Because the physics does not just say that your decision was caused by prior causes going back before your birth. The physics says something stronger. The physics says that the specific neural events that constituted your deliberation, the specific patterns of neuron firing that represented your evaluation of the alternatives, were physical events fully determined by prior physical states. The experience of deliberation, the felt sense of weighing alternatives and arriving at a decision, is a physical process. And that physical process unfolded as it did because the preceding physical state was what it was. This is where the block universe, which I have discussed in multiple earlier videos, becomes directly relevant. In special relativity, space-time is a four-dimensional structure in which every event at every time exists with the same ontological status. The future is not less real than the past, it is simply at a different temporal location in the block. And if the future is in the block, then the future events of your life, including every decision you will ever make, already exist in the block. They are already there at their temporal coordinates, as real and as fixed as the decisions you made years ago that are now in your past. This is the most direct way in which the physics challenges ordinary free will, not through the causal determination of classical mechanics, but through the geometric structure of space-time itself. If the block universe is correct, if future events are as real as present events, then your future decisions are not undetermined. They exist. They are located at specific temporal coordinates in the four-dimensional structure. You will experience them as choices when your world line reaches those coordinates. But from the perspective of the block, they are already there. The compatibilist can respond that the block universe does not prevent the right kind of causal process from being present at those temporal coordinates. The events that constitute your future decisions, even if they are already in the block, will include the deliberative processes, the evaluation of alternatives, the reasoning from values that constitute the kind of causation required for compatibilist free will. The block does not eliminate the deliberation. It just says the deliberation has a specific outcome that is already determined. And the compatibilist says that is fine as long as the outcome is determined by the right kind of process. This is the most direct way in which the physics challenges ordinary free will, not through the causal determination of classical mechanics, but through the geometric structure of space-time itself. If the block universe is correct, if future events are as real as present events, then your future decisions are not undetermined. They exist. They are located at specific temporal coordinates in the four-dimensional structure. You will experience them as choices when your world line reaches those coordinates. But from the perspective of the block, they are already there. Let me be as precise as I can about what the block universe implies for free will, because the implication is often stated loosely, and the looseness obscures what is actually being claimed. The block universe follows from the relativity of simultaneity, which I established in the video about the moment of your birth. Because different observers moving at different velocities disagree about which events are simultaneous, there is no objective, universal present moment. Different observers slice the four-dimensional block at different angles, each slice representing their own present. Events that are in the future for one observer may be in the present or past for another. The same event in space-time can be future, present, or past, depending on the observer's state of motion. This means that the future, for some observer, is the present or past for another observer. And if an event is in the present or past for any observer, it exists in the block as a physical event with a specific physical state. The future decision you have not yet made is for some observer moving through space at the right velocity, already in their past. It has already occurred. It is an event in the block with a specific fixed state. Now, one could respond that this argument proves too much. If the block universe implies that future decisions are already fixed, it also implies that past decisions were once future and therefore also fixed before they occurred. But we do not usually say that past decisions were not free. We say they were free at the time they were made. Why should future decisions be different? The response is that both past and future decisions are fixed in the block, and that this is equally challenging for free will at any time. The decision you made last year, which felt free at the time, was fixed in the block before you made it. The decision you will make next year, which you have not yet experienced, is fixed in the block now. In both cases, the feeling of freedom is generated at the moment of the decision by a physical system that has no access to the block-level fact that the outcome is already fixed. The felt freedom is generated locally by the deliberative process, which has no way of knowing that the outcome is already determined at the block level. This is the most unsettling version of the argument for me. Not that the future is determined by prior causes, which can at least be resisted by arguing that your deliberative process is among those prior causes, but that the future is fixed in the block, period, independent of causation in the ordinary sense. The block does not say that your decision is determined by your prior brain state. It says that your decision is already there as a feature of the four-dimensional structure of space-time, regardless of how we think about causation within that structure. The compatibilist can respond that the block universe is compatible with compatibilist free will because the events in the block include the deliberative processes, the weighing of alternatives, the reasoning from values that constitute the kind of causation required for compatibilist free will. The block does not eliminate the deliberation. It just says the deliberation has a specific outcome that is already fixed. I find this response reasonable but not fully satisfying. The reason is that it seems to conflate two different questions. Compatibilism says yes to the first question and no to the second. But the feeling of free will that I want to account for is the feeling that yes, I deliberated genuinely, and yes, I could have decided differently. Compatibilism preserves the first but abandons the second. And I am not sure that the first by itself is enough. Let me now take you to the neuroscience, because the neuroscience adds a specific and concrete dimension to the abstract physical argument that I think is important and that often gets left out of philosophical discussions. In 1983, the neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that became one of the most discussed results in the neuroscience of free will. The experiment was simple in design. Subjects were asked to flex their wrists whenever they felt like it and to report the position of a clock hand at the moment they first felt the urge to move. EEG recordings measured the electrical activity in the brain. The result was striking. The brain showed a specific electrical signal called the readiness potential that began about 550 milliseconds before the actual movement, but the subjects reported feeling the urge to move only about 200 milliseconds before the movement. The brain was preparing to move about 350 milliseconds before the subject was conscious of intending to move. This result was widely interpreted as evidence that conscious will does not initiate action. The brain prepares the action before the conscious intention arises. The conscious intention, the felt sense of deciding to move, is a consequence of the brain activity rather than a cause of it. The decision was made, in some neural sense, before the person was aware of deciding. Libet's original interpretation of his results was cautious. He noted that subjects reported being able to consciously veto the movement after the urge arose, suggesting that while consciousness might not initiate action, it might be able to cancel actions initiated by unconscious brain processes. He called this free won't rather than free will. But the basic finding that brain activity preceding conscious awareness of intention appears to determine the movement has been replicated in various forms by multiple research groups in subsequent decades. In 1983, the neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that became one of the most discussed results in the neuroscience of free will. The experiment was simple in design. Subjects were asked to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it and to report the position of a clock hand at the moment they first felt the urge to move. EEG recordings measured the electrical activity in the brain. The result was striking. The brain showed a specific electrical signal called the readiness potential, or Bereitschafts potential, that began about 550 milliseconds before the actual movement. but the subjects reported feeling the urge to move only about 200 milliseconds before the movement. The brain was preparing to move about 350 milliseconds before the subject was conscious of intending to move. This result was widely interpreted as evidence that conscious will does not initiate action. The brain prepares the action before the conscious intention arises. The conscious intention, the felt sense of deciding to move, is a consequence of the brain activity rather than a cause of it. The decision was made in some neural sense before the person was aware of deciding. The popular reception of the Libet experiment was dramatic. Headlines declared that neuroscience had disproved free will. The feeling of deciding was revealed to be a post hoc rationalization, a story the brain tells itself after the action has already been initiated unconsciously. You did not decide to move your wrist. Your brain decided and then told you that you had decided. The sense of authorship was retrospectively constructed. Libet's original interpretation of his results was more cautious than the popular reception suggested. He noted that subjects reported being able to consciously veto the movement after the urge arose, even after the readiness potential had begun. This suggested that while consciousness might not initiate action, it might be able to cancel actions initiated by unconscious brain processes. He called this free won't rather than free will. The conscious will might not be the first mover in the sequence of neural events, but it might have veto power over actions that unconscious processes have initiated. Subsequent research has complicated the Libet picture in multiple ways. Some studies have found that the readiness potential does not reliably predict which specific movement a person will make, suggesting that it may not be a direct correlate of a specific decision, but rather a reflection of general preparatory or attentional activity. Studies by John Dylan Haynes and his collaborators using fMRI rather than EEG found that patterns of brain activity in frontal and parietal regions could predict the direction of a binary decision up to 10 seconds before the subject reported being conscious of the decision, a result more striking than Libet's and harder to explain away. But other studies have questioned whether the predictive activity represents a committed decision or merely a fluctuating prior tendency that can be overridden. The philosopher of neuroscience, Alfred Mele, has written extensively about the limitations of the Libet results and of subsequent studies in the same tradition. He argues that the experimental paradigm in which subjects are asked to make arbitrary wrist movements with no particular stakes or considerations is far from the ordinary deliberative decisions that free will theorists care about. The neural processes that precede a snap decision to flex a wrist are not necessarily the same as the neural processes that precede a considered decision about a morally important action. The inference from the former to the latter is not well supported. I think Mele's caution is warranted. The Libet experiments are not a knockdown argument against free will. The neuroscience is more complicated and more contested than the popular reception suggests. But I also think the broader point holds. The brain is a physical system. Its decisions are physical events. And the general picture in which the brain's neural activity determines decisions in ways that are at least partly prior to conscious awareness is well supported by the neuroscience, even if the specific Libet results are disputed. The neuroscience of Libet is more complex than the headlines suggest. There have been serious methodological criticisms. The timing of the conscious intention, as reported by subjects watching a clock, is difficult to measure precisely. More recent experiments using different methods have produced somewhat different results. The neuroscience of voluntary action is more complicated than the simple Libet story implies, and the implications for free will are more contested among neuroscientists and philosophers than the popular accounts suggest. But even setting aside the specific Libet results, the broader neuroscientific picture is challenging for libertarian free will. The brain is a physical system. It operates according to the laws of physics and chemistry. Its activity is determined by the patterns of neural connectivity, by the neurotransmitter levels, by the hormonal environment, by the prior history of activity that shaped the synaptic strengths. There is no evidence of any process in the brain that operates outside of or independently of the physical laws that govern all other matter. If a physical system's behavior is determined by its physical state, and if the physical state of the brain is determined by prior physical states, then the behavior of the brain, including the decisions it produces, is determined by prior physical states. The neuroscience does not prove that free will is an illusion. It is compatible with compatibilist free will, which only requires that the right kind of physical process be operating in the brain, not that the process be non-physical. But it is incompatible with the libertarian free will that requires the ability to have done otherwise in a physically meaningful sense. And it suggests that the subjective experience of deliberating and choosing, the felt sense of authorship that I described at the beginning, is generated by a physical system that does not have the properties that the experience implies. Let me now connect all of this to the specific physical picture that I have been developing throughout this video series. The argument against free will from physics is strongest, not from classical determinism alone, not from the Libet experiments alone, not even from the block universe alone, but from the combination of all of these into a coherent physical picture of what a decision actually is. A decision is a physical event. Specifically, it is a pattern of neural activity that results in a specific behavioral output. That pattern of neural activity is the product of a prior pattern of neural activity, which is the product of a prior pattern going back through the entire history of the brain's development, which is the product of genetics and environment, which is the product of prior physical states extending back to the beginning of the universe. At the quantum level, the neural activity involves quantum events, quantum fluctuations in ion channels, quantum processes in the synaptic machinery that are genuinely random in the quantum mechanical sense. These quantum events introduce genuine indeterminism, but as I argued earlier, this indeterminism is not freedom, it is randomness. The decision that results from random neural fluctuations is not more free than one determined by prior causes. It is less predictable. It is not more authored. At the level of the block universe, the decision already exists at its temporal coordinate in the four-dimensional space-time structure. From the perspective of the block, every decision you will ever make is already located at its temporal position, as real and as fixed as the decisions you made years ago. The felt experience of deliberating and choosing, which you will experience when your world line reaches those temporal coordinates, is already there in the block, already settled, already part of the permanent structure of space-time. Put the determinism, the quantum randomness, and the block universe together, and what you get is a picture of a decision as a physical event that is either determined by prior causes or random, and that already exists at its temporal location in the space-time block. In neither of these physical descriptions is there room for the kind of authorship that the felt experience of free will implies. The felt experience is real as an experience. The authorship it implies is not real as a physical fact. This is why I call free will the most convincing illusion physics has ever produced. Not an illusion in the sense of being false as an experience. The experience of deliberating and choosing is genuine. The felt sense of weighing alternatives is genuine. The sense that you are the author of your decisions is genuine as a phenomenological fact. But the specific implication of that experience, that the decision could have gone otherwise in a physically meaningful sense, that your authorship is ultimate in the sense that it is not reducible to prior physical causes or random processes, that implication does not correspond to anything in the physics. The illusion is convincing because it is generated by a process that has been shaped by evolution to be convincing. The experience of deliberating and choosing serves important functions. It motivates careful consideration of alternatives. It creates the sense of responsibility that is essential for social cooperation. It generates the motivation for long-term planning and self-improvement. A creature that did not experience its decisions as its own, that did not feel the sense of authorship over its choices, would not be well adapted to the social and cognitive demands of human life. The experience of free will has been selected by evolution because it is useful, not because it accurately represents the underlying physics. The illusion is convincing because it is generated by a process that has been shaped by evolution to be convincing. The experience of deliberating and choosing serves important functions. It motivates careful consideration of alternatives. It creates the sense of responsibility that is essential for social cooperation. It generates the motivation for long-term planning and self-improvement. A creature that did not experience its decisions as its own, that did not feel the sense of authorship over its choices, would not be well adapted to the social and cognitive demands of human life. The experience of free will has been selected by evolution because it is useful, not because it accurately represents the underlying physics. Let me develop this evolutionary point a little further, because I think it is important and often overlooked. The sense of authorship over decisions is not just a pleasant feeling. It is a functional requirement for the kind of complex social coordination that human beings engage in. Consider what it would mean to lack the sense of authorship. A person who felt no sense of ownership over their decisions, who experienced their actions as happening to them rather than coming from them, would have no basis for commitment, for promise-keeping, for long-term planning, for the kind of self-directed behavior that complex social life requires. The feeling of being the author of your actions is not separate from your ability to be an agent in any robust sense. It is constitutive of it. Evolution, then, would strongly favor neural architectures that generate a robust experience of authorship, regardless of whether that experience accurately represents the underlying physical reality. The felt sense of free will would be selected not because the alternatives it feels like choosing between are genuinely open, but because feeling like they are open motivates the kind of careful deliberation that produces better outcomes on average. The feeling of freedom does real work, whether or not the freedom it represents is real in the metaphysical sense. This evolutionary picture has a specific implication that I find both interesting and slightly unsettling. It suggests that the felt experience of free will is more convincing than the underlying reality warrants by design. Natural selection does not calibrate the experience to the metaphysics. It calibrates the experience to what works. And what works for the kinds of decisions human beings make is a strong sense of authorship and a strong sense of genuine alternatives. The illusion is optimized for effectiveness, not for accuracy. This does not mean the experience is worthless. An experience that motivates good deliberation and good decision-making is valuable regardless of whether it accurately represents the metaphysics. The person who deliberates carefully, who takes their choices seriously, who holds themselves accountable for their decisions, is a better agent in all the practical senses that matter, even if the metaphysical picture says the deliberation had a fixed outcome and the accountability is not grounded in ultimate desert. But it does mean that the felt sense of free will is not trustworthy as evidence about the metaphysics. The vividness of the experience, the felt certainty that the alternatives were genuinely open, tells us something about how evolution has calibrated human consciousness. It does not tell us something about whether the underlying physical reality has the properties the experience implies. I want to be careful and am not claiming, because I think the implications are both important and easy to misstate. I am not claiming that there are no differences between free decisions and coerced ones. There are. The distinctions that compatibilism identifies are real. A decision made under duress is different from a decision made in a state of calm reflection. A decision made with full information is different from one made with false information. A decision produced by a healthy deliberative process is different from one produced by a malfunctioning brain. These differences are real and they matter for moral and legal purposes, even if they do not restore the ultimate authorship that the physics removes. I am not claiming that moral responsibility is meaningless. The compatibilist framework for moral responsibility, which focuses on the processes that produce decisions rather than on ultimate authorship, captures most of what we care about in practice. We hold people responsible for decisions that issue from their own deliberative processes, their own values, their own reasoning. We do not hold them responsible for outcomes over which they had no control. This framework works practically. It corresponds to genuine differences in the causal history of decisions. It is the framework that legal and moral systems actually use. And nothing in the physics removes the validity of this framework for practical purposes. What I am claiming is that the physics removes the metaphysical foundation that we intuitively believe underlies the practical framework. We believe that the deliberative process could have gone otherwise, that the person who made a bad decision could have made a good one, not just in the trivial sense that a different person in a different brain state would have decided differently, but in the strong sense that this person with this brain at this moment genuinely had the ability to choose differently. The physics says this is not true. The decision that was made was the one that the physics required, whether through determination by prior causes or through quantum randomness. No decision had the property of genuine alternative possibilities in the physically meaningful sense. And the experience of having that property, the felt sense of genuine alternatives, is generated by a brain that does not have access to the underlying physics. The brain knows it is deliberating. It knows it feels undecided. It generates the experience of weighing alternatives, but it does not know, cannot know, that the deliberation has a fixed outcome, that the feeling of being undecided is generated by a process that is already pointing toward a specific result. The experience of genuine alternatives is a feature of the phenomenology. It is not a feature of the physics. Now, let me address the objection that I think is most powerful, because I want to engage with it honestly. The objection is that I have been assuming that the laws of physics are complete, that the physical description of a decision is the complete description, that there is nothing left over once the physics is described. But perhaps this assumption is wrong. Perhaps consciousness or free will or the deliberative process is not fully captured by the physical description. Perhaps there is something about the first-person experience of deciding that escapes the third-person physical description. This is the position of those who think that consciousness or free will requires some additional ingredient beyond physics, something that the physical description leaves out. It is a position taken seriously by some philosophers, including those who defend property dualism or panpsychism or other views that give consciousness a fundamental status, not reducible to physical processes. I find these positions genuinely uncertain. I do not know with confidence that consciousness is fully reducible to physical processes. The hard problem of consciousness, which I have discussed in several earlier videos, is a real problem that has not been solved. The question of whether the felt experience of deliberating and choosing can be fully explained by the physical processes in the brain is genuinely open. It is possible that there is something about the first-person experience of decision that escapes the third-person physical description, and that this something provides the additional ingredient needed for genuine free will. But I notice that this response to the physics argument requires believing that consciousness has properties that no physical process can account for, properties that somehow escape the causal structure of the physical world, while still being able to influence the physical outcomes of decisions. And I do not know what kind of thing that would be, or how it would interact with the physical brain, or how we would detect it or study it. The appeal to something beyond physics is logically available. But without a specific theory of what that something is and how it works, it is more a name for our uncertainty than a solution to the problem. I want to close with something that I think is the most honest and the most important thing I can say about free will and physics. The honest thing is that this question is not settled. The physics creates a genuine problem for the ordinary understanding of free will. The problem is not solved by compatibilism, which preserves the practice of holding people responsible but abandons the metaphysical foundation of ultimate authorship. The problem is not solved by appeal to quantum randomness, which introduces indeterminism but not freedom. The problem is not solved by appeal to something beyond physics, which is available as a logical option but not developed into a specific theory. I want to close with something that I think is the most honest and the most important thing I can say about free will and physics. The honest thing is that this question is not settled. The physics creates a genuine problem for the ordinary understanding of free will. The problem is not solved by compatibilism, which preserves the practice of holding people responsible but abandons the metaphysical foundation of ultimate authorship. The problem is not solved by appeal to quantum randomness, which introduces indeterminism but not freedom. The problem is not solved by appeal to something beyond physics, which is available as a logical option but not developed into a specific theory. I want to address that appeal to something beyond physics more carefully because I think it deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal. The appeal typically takes one of several forms. Some philosophers argue that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the felt experience of deliberating and choosing has properties that no physical description can capture, and that these irreducible properties might provide the basis for genuine libertarian free will. Philosophers in the tradition of property dualism or emergentism, who take consciousness seriously as a non-physical or at least not fully physical phenomenon, sometimes argue that the physical causal closure of the universe, the claim that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause, might be violated at the level of conscious decision-making. I find this response genuinely uncertain. The hard problem of consciousness is real. I have discussed it in several other videos in this series, and I do not want to be dismissive of it here. The specific quality of experience, the what it is likeness of deliberating and choosing, might not be fully captured by the physical description of the brain. And if consciousness has properties that escape physical description, those properties might provide the basis for genuine alternatives in the metaphysically relevant sense. But I notice two difficulties with this response. The first is that we do not have a specific theory of how non-physical or incompletely physical consciousness would interact with the physical brain to produce physical decisions. The interaction problem, how an immaterial or non-physical will influences the physical processes of the brain, has been recognized as a serious difficulty since Descartes. If the physical brain state determines the physical outcome of a decision through the ordinary laws of physics, where does the non-physical will enter? If it does not enter, how does it influence the decision? If the physical causal closure is violated, what is the mechanism of violation? The second difficulty is that even if we grant that consciousness has non-physical properties, it does not follow that these properties provide genuine libertarian freedom. The question is whether the non-physical aspects of consciousness provide the kind of authorship that free will requires, not just indeterminism, but genuine self-determination, the ability to be the source of one's actions in a way that is not reducible to prior causes, physical or otherwise. These difficulties are not fatal to the appeal to something beyond physics. They are challenges that need to be met by a developed theory of consciousness and free will. But in the absence of such a theory, the appeal is a promissory note, a placeholder for a solution that has not yet been provided. What the physics does is make the question more precise. And in forcing this precision, it reveals that the intuitive concept of free will contains multiple distinct elements that may not all be simultaneously achievable. The authenticity of the decision as an expression of the person's values, the genuine possibility of deciding otherwise, the absence of external coercion, the rational deliberative basis of the decision. Physics threatens some of these elements while leaving others intact, and the question of which elements are essential to the concept we care about is a question that physics cannot answer. It is a question about what matters, which is a question for ethics and for human self-understanding. But the starting point of that question has been irrevocably changed by the physics. We cannot return to the naive Newtonian picture in which the future was open and decisions were written only in the moment of their making. We know now that the future is in the block, that decisions are physical events, that the brain is a physical system governed by physical laws, and that the felt experience of choosing, however genuine as an experience, is generated by a process that does not have the properties that the experience implies. You have already made every decision you will ever make. They are at their temporal coordinates in the block. You will experience them as choices when your world line arrives at those coordinates. And the experience of choosing will be as vivid and as genuine and as meaningful as it has always been, because the experience is real. The physics only changes what the experience is an experience of. Let me say something about why I think this matters beyond the intellectual. Because the question of free will is not just an academic puzzle. It is the question of how we should understand ourselves as agents in the world. And the answer the physics suggests is both more and less disturbing than it initially appears. It is more disturbing because the physics is not merely saying that the future is causally determined. It is saying that the future is already in the block, already there, already as real and as fixed as the past. The person you will be in 10 years, making the decisions that will seem so important then, is already in the block with their decisions already fixed. You will experience those decisions as choices. The physics says they are already made. It is less disturbing because nothing about this picture changes the experience. The deliberation is real. The values are real. The reasoning is real. The process of weighing alternatives and arriving at a decision is a genuine physical process that has genuine physical consequences. The fact that the outcome is already in the block does not make the process less real or less yours. It makes it a fixed feature of the permanent space-time structure rather than an open possibility that could go either way. But the fixed feature is still the product of your deliberation, your values, your character. In the only sense that matters practically, it is still your decision. Let me say something about why I think this matters beyond the intellectual. Because the question of free will is not just an academic puzzle. It is the question of how we should understand ourselves as agents in the world. And the answer the physics suggests is both more and less disturbing than it initially appears. It is more disturbing because the physics is not merely saying that the future is causally determined. It is saying that the future is already in the block, already there, already as real and as fixed as the past. The person you will be in 10 years, making the decisions that will seem so important then, is already in the block, with their decisions already fixed. You will experience those decisions as choices. The physics says they are already made. But here is the specific question I want to sit with for a moment. Does knowing this change anything about how you should deliberate? Does knowing that the outcome is already in the block give you any reason to deliberate less carefully, to take your choices less seriously, to be less committed to acting well? I think the answer is no, and the reason is interesting. The fact that the outcome is already in the block does not give you access to the outcome. You do not know what is in the block at your future coordinates. The deliberation that will lead to the outcome is part of the block. The values you bring to that deliberation are part of the block. The quality of your reasoning is part of the block. All of these are at their temporal coordinates, fixed. But fixed does not mean bypassed. The fact that the deliberation is fixed in the block means that the deliberation will happen with whatever quality it has, and that quality will determine the outcome. Knowing that the outcome is fixed in the block does not change the fact that it is fixed as the outcome of a deliberative process that you will actually undergo. This is a strange loop. The deliberation is fixed in the block. The quality of the deliberation is fixed in the block. Your knowledge of the block is fixed in the block. Your response to that knowledge, including your decision about whether to take deliberation seriously in light of what you know, is fixed in the block. There is no standpoint from which you can step outside the block and change anything, because the standpoint you take is itself in the block. This is why I find the practical implications of determinism and the block universe less significant than their metaphysical implications. Metaphysically, the block removes ultimate authorship and genuine alternative possibilities. Practically, it changes nothing about the deliberative structure of decision-making. You still have to decide. The deliberation still matters. The values you bring to it still shape the outcome. You just now know or believe that the outcome has been fixed all along, even as you are in the process of fixing it. The experience of free will is the most convincing illusion physics has ever produced because it is indistinguishable from the inside from what it would be like if free will were real. A genuine deliberation in a genuinely open future would feel exactly like a fixed deliberation in a block universe. The experience is the same, the metaphysics is different, and the only way to know the difference is to do the physics, which tells you that the block is the correct picture, but which cannot be felt directly in any experience. It is less disturbing because nothing about this picture changes the experience. The deliberation is real. The values are real. The reasoning is real. The process of weighing alternatives and arriving at a decision is a genuine physical process that has genuine physical consequences. The fact that the outcome is already in the block does not make the process less real or less yours. It makes it a fixed feature of the permanent space-time structure rather than an open possibility that could go either way. But the fixed feature is still the product of your deliberation, your values, your character. In the only sense that matters practically, it is still your decision. The most convincing illusion physics has ever produced is not the one that shows you something that is not there. The deliberation is real. The decision is real. The authorship, in the compatibilist sense, is real. What is not real is the specific implication that you draw from all of this. The implication that you could have chosen differently, that the future was genuinely open, that your decision was the starting point of a causal chain rather than a link in one that stretches back to the beginning of everything. Let me make one final observation about the relationship between physics and free will that I think captures something important about the entire discussion. Throughout this conversation, I have been arguing that the physics creates a genuine problem for free will. I have taken the physics seriously and followed its implications. But I want to note something about the act of doing this, because I think it is relevant to the question of free will itself. The activity of reasoning carefully about a difficult question, of weighing evidence and argument, of being responsive to reasons and willing to revise one's position in light of new considerations, is exactly the activity that compatibilists point to as the hallmark of free action. When I engage with the arguments about free will, weighing the considerations for and against different positions, revising my views in light of new arguments, I am being exactly the kind of reasons responsive agent that compatibilists describe. And here is the irony. If I conclude, as a result of this careful reasoning, that free will in the libertarian sense does not exist, then my conclusion was reached by exercising exactly the kind of rational agency that compatibilism preserves. The reasoning that leads to the conclusion that libertarian free will is unavailable is itself an exercise of the kind of free agency that compatibilism endorses. The conclusion does not undermine the process that produced it. The process is genuine, rational, reasons, responsive, agency, exactly what compatibilism preserves. The conclusion is that the metaphysical foundation of ultimate authorship, the kind that libertarianism requires, is not available. This is not a contradiction, it is a clarification. The physics removes ultimate authorship. It preserves everything else. The deliberation, the reasoning, the responsiveness to evidence, the capacity to reach correct conclusions about difficult questions, all of this survives the physics. What does not survive is the claim that the process could have produced a different conclusion, that the reasoning was the starting point of an undetermined chain, that you, at the moment of reaching the conclusion, could have reached a different one with the same brain in the same state. You have already made every decision you will ever make. They are at their temporal coordinates in the block. You will experience them as choices when your world line arrives at those coordinates, and the experience of choosing will be as vivid and as genuine and as meaningful as it has always been, because the experience is real. The physics only changes what the experience is an experience of, and it is the most convincing one physics has ever produced, because it is generated by the very faculties, the deliberative, self-aware, value-tracking neural architecture that physics has shaped over billions of years of evolution to feel exactly this way. If this shifts something in how you think about the decisions you make, if the next time you deliberate something feels different about the experience, knowing that the outcome is already in the block, tell me in the comments. Tell me whether you find compatibilism genuinely satisfying or whether you think it misses the point. Tell me whether the Libet experiments change anything for you. And tell me whether you think free will is worth preserving as a concept after everything the physics has done to it and what you would be preserving. These are the questions that matter most. And subscribe if you want to keep going into the places where physics meets the deepest questions about who we are